My question for you is, what was your imagining for Raziel for the voice?
Gordon Hunt had said, we want you to do an English dialect. Gordon had directed me in the Smurfs and the Snorks. And it was like something, you know. And, you know, that's how you do it.
What's up, you beautiful bastards? As always, need to mark that this is one of the many episodes of this video series, so if you're new here, click the upper right link. In the last episode, Pablo Chiropractor played a gamble, or threw a coin if you will, and activated one of the Mobius's time-traveling devices to, you guessed it, time travel. I always thought it was kinda strange that Razi talks about time limitations here.
I had no choice but to act purely on blind faith. There was no way to tell what error this device was tuned to, and I had neither the knowledge nor the means to set the machine myself. I hesitated only briefly.
I suppose he could even take 100 years to figure out how this thing works and just go to the exact time he needs. Not to mention that scholarship loans was still not invented in the realm of Nosgoth, so there are always options. Yet I presume starting in a semi-apocalyptic world would make for not the most engaging gameplay. So the tides of the storytelling conveniently take us to the exact point we had to be in.
Beyond all hope and against all probability, it seemed that the device had unerringly delivered me to the era I sought. For these were Sarafan banners, and these vampires apparently the victims of their crusade. The coincidence seemed too convenient to naively ascribe to fate. But whether my opportune arrival had been orchestrated by Mobius or some other influence, I didn't know. If JanosAudron still lived, I would find him. I was wary of further deception and resolved to tread carefully.
Raziel appears 500 years prior to the events of the First Blood Omen. Suffering from the blood curse, the Ancient Ones had to somehow procreate, so many people were turned into vampires, sometimes even against their own will. And by many I mean a lot, which is visible by the amount of ex-humans literally chilling on the stakes. Such a drastic change in Wemp's population wasn't to the liking of humans, especially considering the fact that many children were straight up kidnapped to become bloodsuckers, so they formed an order which we now know under the name Sarafan, thus beginning their crusade against the aforementioned vampires.
By all that is holy!
Here at last, in the flesh, I beheld my former brothers in arms, the warrior priests of the Sarafan Order, their lives devoted solely to the annihilation of the vampire plague. And while I confess, I felt a twinge of longing, a pang of grief for what I had believed was my lost virtue, I regarded them now with none of the reverence I formerly felt. For I had seen the human face of the vampires, and now I beheld the monstrousness of these men.
Sarafan's cruelty doesn't omit Raziel's gaze, and even if we would consider kidnapping and the fact that vampires had to somehow sustain themselves, such barbarity would put people not very far from their blood-sucking adversaries. And if we would come back to my question on how well the vampires were implemented into society from the first video and this passage of Razi,
Things in this world, I am learning, are rarely what they seem.
I always thought it was strange that Raziel refers to the human side of the vampires. I mean, as a vampire, Raziel was pretty devious. We could observe this in the SoulReaver comic book, which shows us a bit of life of the first lieutenant before his execution. I don't think that what he saw after his awakening as a wraith and what he did as the first lieutenant could be marked as humane, especially considering his very fast change of heart after uncovering his Sarafan past. Maybe he saw something humane in Wardor because he was kinda sweet to Raziel during their meeting, but the Green Goblin was actually a fucking maniac if you would consider the First Blood Omen. Of course, he became like this because of the human persecution, but what's human about that? Even animals can resort to revenge. I mean, it's more like Raziel saw the demon side of the Sarafan in all of that Dracula-like cruelty, but from the side of the vampires there wasn't anything good at all. Well, from what was given to us as players at least. Yet they were cool architects, I guess. There's not so many things to tell about the Sarafan soldiers. They look very cool and kinda angelic, but from the gameplay standpoint, it's the same dumb NPCs. I like that they made Kanmias into bold mage ladies though. Gives out that more ancient and magical flair to this time. After giving hell to our ex-comrades in Faith, we go through the already explored canyon and get inside of Ushtenheim. I prefer the non-ruined look of it much more. Once again, hats off to the sound designers of SoulReaver. You would never believe how much worse a game feels when the sound design is made dull or too repetitive. Here we have different sounds for icy, slightly and moderately snowy surfaces and the regular ones as well. I also forgot to mention that they picked a very cool sound when Raziel walks on the shadows in the forges. And don't know about you, but the sound of Raziel's claws piercing through something, as well as this menu click sound, I'm sure Apple stole it, are so pleasant to my ears. I know it's more of a nostalgia thing, but in my opinion, this game has a crazy good sound design. Let me know if you want me to make an ASMR of the sounds from the SoulReaver.
After my long journey, I finally stood on the threshold of enlightenment. For here was JanosAudron's mountain retreat, intact and unblemished. The upheaval that would one day topple this ancient edifice had not yet occurred. And while I had no certainty that Janos still lived, this scene boded well, for I presumed that the collapse of the retreat must have followed the ancient vampire's demise. There was only one obstacle: how to reach the balcony suspended at that maddening height, so far beyond my reach. For this was the architecture of winged creatures. The tattered ruins of my wings were of no use. I would need to devise some other means into that mountain.
You know, this game makes me question my brain capabilities at times, because it took me a little while to get through this otherworldly sphincter. From the get-go we see that this place has a peculiar architecture style, with the bright violet color, underwater vampiric arches, and these Daedric-like framing everywhere, but that was just the beginning.
The mountain's interior was hollow, I discovered, and graced with soaring architecture unique to its creators. As with the outer facade, these balconies and galleries could only be reached by those gifted with flight. With only my ruined wings to carry me, this towering labyrinth seemed impassable, while the object of my quest lay just beyond my grasp. For here, suspended at the apex of the chamber, was the threshold that surely led to the great vampire himself. I didn't know whether JanosAudron was the monster depicted in the stronghold, or one of the noble creatures memorialized among the ruins of the ancient vampires. But I didn't care. Demon or angel, he alone held the key to my destiny.
I really love the layout of the place. It looks very distinctive, cold and menacing, just like the masters of the place themselves. I also love the fact that along the way to Janos' retreat we can spot a few similar structures that would be hard to get to without a pair of wings. Another beautiful world-building thing that makes the world of Nosgoth more believable. I also like the spin on the blood magic during solving the puzzles. It's indeed very cool to see creative ways of implementing magic for more or less practical ways. I could easily imagine the turned wingless vampires doing all of this blood-carrying routine to meet with Janos because, well, it must be getting boring when you live for so long. It's just like in prisons. You imagine a lot of dumb activities when you have a lot of time on your hands. The riddle itself was not that hard actually. It's like with IQ tests. When you see those for the first time, you're like, fuck, what do they want from me? But after solving a few of them, it all starts to make sense. Same thing with the riddles in this game. The first forge could have made you doubt your intellectual abilities, but if you manage to get here somehow, it becomes not that bad with time. Not a big fan of backtracking though, yet they took care of the players by providing these bloody holes. No pun intended. I also like the fact that there is animation for pouring in and out of these blood jars. I think the riddle had to be much more convoluted, with more actions regarding blood in these vessels, and thank God the devs stopped where they did. Finally we get to talk with our ancient blue target, so I'll let our friends do exactly that.
JanosAudron?
It is heartening after all these years to hear my name spoken without contempt.
Raziel?
My child, what have they done to you?
I have been dragged through hell and back. All it seems to reach this moment. But I don't yet know why.
For thousands of years I have waited, alone here, losing faith. At the time of the binding, 9 guardians were called to serve the pillars, and I was summoned as the 10th guardian, the keeper of the Reaver, the weapon of our salvation. Over time, our race died out, until I alone remained, sustained only by my obligation to you and by my guardianship of the blade.
And the other 9? Why did their guardianship not sustain them?
I don't know. As our race dwindled, the humans prospered. I have watched over the centuries as our history faded into myth and finally receded altogether. The humans have forgotten us entirely and claimed the pillars for themselves, wholly ignorant of their true purpose. To them, I am merely a devil, the origin of their vampire plague.
Why would the pillars summon human guardians then, if they are meant to be served by vampires?
The pillars choose their guardians from birth, Raziel, and vampires are no longer born. This is the crux of our dilemma, and this is the terrible irony. With their vampire purge, the members of the Circle have assaulted the very architects of the pillars they are sworn to protect. They have embarked on a treacherous path. With every vampire they kill, the humans are slitting their own throats. They know I'm up here, beyond their reach, and it terrifies them. You can see how they flaunt their kills to torment me, or perhaps simply to lure me out. They have this foolish notion that destroying me will somehow topple our entire bloodline. Thankfully, we're not that fragile.
I have seen them mustering their forces in the village below.
Yes. I don't know what they're plotting, but I fear our time may be bitterly short.
Mankind seems to have brought you only torment and grief. You must hate them.
They fear what they don't understand, and they despise what they fear. But no, I do not hate them. Vorador does. He has suffered much. He cannot forgive them.
Should they be forgiven?
They don't understand what they're doing. They are simply unenlightened and vulnerable to manipulation.
So, it's all true then, what Kain and Vorador have told me. I really am some kind of unholy vampire messiah.
Unholy? No. Messiah, perhaps.
I don't like that word. It smells of martyrdom.
Raziel, your role in this world's destiny is more crucial and more benevolent than you've allowed yourself to believe. Your journey will not be easy. Dark powers are allied against you. But I think you already know this. You appear to have been cruelly tested. The binding must be secured, Raziel. The pillars are the lock.
And the Reaver is the key.
Yes.
The Reaver is here. Why do I feel nothing?
The most formidable weapon ever forged by our swordsmiths. They infused the blade with vampiric energy, empowering the Reaver to drain our enemies of their precious lifeblood.
As Janos presented the blade, an inexplicable sense of dread crept over me, more palpable than anything I'd felt before. I was at once horribly repelled by the sword, and yet irresistibly compelled to touch it, to take it up. Please, take it away from me.
I fear you have been followed. You must save yourself, Raziel.
Janos! No! My surroundings whirled sickeningly, and I found myself transported safely away from the ambush to an adjacent chamber. Janos had delivered me from the Sarafan, selflessly forfeiting his own safety to preserve my life. And now I feared that my newfound mentor would be slaughtered by the very crusaders I had so recently revered. The irony pierced me, and with dawning horror, I realized that I had been duped by Mobius from the beginning. For the Sarafan had simply followed the path I gullibly blazed through this sanctuary, and had arrived bearing Mobius' staff. Thus armed, they had Janos at their mercy. Through the door, I could hear them battling, less than a dozen paces away. But it may as well have been 1,000 miles, for this barrier was sealed by elemental forces I did not possess. It seemed Janos had conveyed me into the heart of the fire shrine. I thought perhaps if I could galvanize the forge and imbue the Reaver in time, I might have a slim chance of saving Janos from his grisly fate.
I mean, although it's my bread and butter, I don't want to retell all of what you've just heard. Instead, I want to talk a little about Janos himself. Despite the fact that he sounds like a guy who would surely invite us for a round of bowling, he appears to not to be the scourge he was described as by Sarafan Audron. Yet I'm still peculiar if even a fracture of that description was true. As we can see, he did admit that new vampires were never born, thus partially admitting the fact of children kidnapping. I can presume that the 10th Guardian himself haven't had to feed on the humans because of the forces of the balance that would sustain him or something like this. By a cutscene from the better version of SoulReaver 2.
Damn those Sarafan!
We must find a way to stop these loathsome humans. What are you?
We can presume that there was some vampires still in contact with him, considering that the vampires themselves were in the proximity of his merry house. Considering also that they had to somehow sustain themselves, and the fact that he is a big fan of vampires, being the coolest one himself, I don't think that he would advocate against his relatives feeding on others. Another thing,
It is heartening after all these years to hear my name spoken without contempt.
it means that most of the time he had it with a degree of contempt, to say the least. I presume he would defend himself and would do it pretty often, considering the corpses of vampires outside as a bait and what Cain said in the first Blood Omen. I don't think that all of those rumors could appear from the thin air, though he did say that he's been waiting for thousands of years there, so maybe he didn't. To be honest, I don't know. It seems he wasn't a demon that was described by the Sarafan, yet Warador, for example, indeed was. As Raziels said,
Things in this world, I am learning, are rarely what they seem.
I think it's up to you to decide. Me personally would forgive him everything for such a comfy fireplace with the bookshelves. Anyway, we were thrown into the Fire Forge, and in the Fire Forge we are. The forge itself is the last and the smallest one of them all. And just like Janos's fireplace, I find it very comfy with the more Romantic style arches, Gothic stained glass windows and gargoyles spitting blood. The riddle to it was a throwback to the Fire Forge we had in the first game, where a torch had to be lit and taken from point A to point B, yet I kinda missed the demonic demon fire god. Razi's statue with the flaming Soul Reaver looked cool as well though, so whatever. The sword imbued with fire energy went through the threshold of the gate, opening our gaze to the unfolding drama. So I'll just shut the fuck up for now.
Look at his black heart! How it still beats!
The fiend intends to bury us alive. Raziel, we must get out of here.
Remember the sword!
Forgive me. I'm sorry. I failed you.
No, Raziel. Perhaps this was my true purpose. Simply to save your life this once.
While I have taken yours.
Embrace your destiny, Raziel. You must reclaim the Reaver. It was forged for you and you alone. Without it, there is no hope.
As I backed away from Janos's body, I was overwhelmed by a sense of self-loathing so deep I could barely contain it. In that instant, I rejected all that I ever was, and embraced the role Janos had safeguarded for me so patiently throughout the centuries. I knew then what I had to do, the task for which I was uniquely prepared. I would pursue the Sarafan dogs to their loathsome fortress and avenge JanosAudron's murder. Mobius would pay dearly for his treachery, and my Sarafan brethren would reap the horrors they had sown. I would retake the stolen Reaver, which was rightfully mine. And finally, when all these debts had been paid, I would reclaim JanosAudron's heart from their filthy, unworthy hands. If the heart was truly imbued with the power to restore vampiric unlife, its highest purpose was clear to me. I would restore the heart to Janos, and thus undo the vile crime committed by my abominable former self.
Yep, Raziel meets Raziel. The white Caucasian Raziel skedaddles, and the blue Raziel finally duplicates the scene that we saw in the chronoplast in the first game. I have nothing to add actually, besides the fact that I love Emily Henning and her machinations to make this throwback possible. Just genius. Thank you very much, you beautiful individuals. If you want to know how the drama unfolded, leave this channel a croissant, a lupus, and sublime yourself to it. Stay tuned because there is much more to come. I love you. For real, for real.